Hey, welcome to a new series of videos I'm going to make, and in this series I'm going to show you how to make a marking gauge. Now there are two kind of broad categories of marking gauge, and there are, well, first are the pin marking gauges. They use a pin for the kind of marking implement, and this kind of style is very popular, or very common. It's rosewood and brass with some, well, a pin. This is actually a mortising gauge, so it has two, but usually for a normal marking gauge it has one pin, and you can adjust it, etc. And usually have a thumb screw here to lock the arm. And these are, well, not so good because the pin, if you don't sharpen it and use it as they come, it will tear out on cross-grain marking cuts. Because obviously you're not cutting across the grain, you're just kind of scratching with the pin, so it will just kind of leave a really rugged surface. So not so good. So usually people sharpen the pin to a kind of a knife, a small knife edge, and that helps, but still you have to be really careful to go across the grain because they will just dig in and kind of rip. So not such a good option, although they're common, so you can get them pretty much anywhere. So if you're kind of stuck for choice, or you can't be bothered to make your own and you're on a budget, then these are probably your last option. But really, making one is easy, and you can make a better tool and for a lot cheaper. Which brings me to the second type of gauge, which use a kind of knife edge as your marking implement. And they're kind of in two categories as well. So there's ones with an actual knife, a little piece of iron or steel or whatever, sharpened to a kind of a knife edge, and there's the ones with wheels. Now the wheel ones are good from the reports I've seen, and you know, they work great, but the downsides to them are, one, that they're pretty expensive, $20–30 each. So if you need 2, 3, 4 of these things in your shop, which you really should have because they're quite useful, it will end up costing you quite a bit of money. The second disadvantage of those is the wheel is not sharpenable really, because they're so small and they're round. So you have to buy replacement wheels, which is a kind of uncertainty as to how long they'll be on the market for. 30 years down the road, will you be able to get marking wheel kind of replacements? So I'm going to show you how to make a cutting gauge, kind of pretty traditional one. And they're cheap and easy to make, and they're a good practice project for you. So this is the gauge I'll be showing you how to make. Now this is kind of based on a French design. The original article for making these was in Popular Woodworking. It's like a while back, I think, but you can find the article online in PDF form, and it's a French design apparently, but the original tool was found by the author in, I think, Benjamin Seaton's chest, who was an Englishman. But you know, it's a French design. Now the plans in the article call for a pin, and as I said earlier, they're not really that great. So I've replaced the pin with a knife, and another modification I've made is I've actually made the arm radius here. You can see the bottom edge is radius, and I've made a matching radius in the kind of body there for the arm, so that when you actually slide this in and go to lock the wedge down, the wedge will push down on the arm into this radius, so it won't wobble kind of laterally. These marking gauges, if you use a square arm, they have a tendency to wobble kind of like this when these side walls wear down. You really want a tight fit on these two side walls if you use a square gauge, so that this, you know, won't wobble sideways. But that's pretty hard to achieve in the first place, and to have the arm operate smoothly. And secondly, once you slide this arm back and forth a few times to use it, it's just going to wear down, so it's not really realistic to expect it to be, you know, high tolerance for the working life of the tool. So that's why I've added this radius. These two modifications aren't original to me, by the way. Millions of people have done this before. But this radius helps lock the arm in place. So even if your mortise isn't perfectly sized to your arm, as long as these two radius are roughly matching, you will get a solid lock, even if these the arm or the mortise wear down in use. So you can find a video on how to make these, the traditional version, on Bob Rosicki's page. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but he has a page called Logan Cabinet Shop, and on his podcast there, he shows you how to make the kind of French gauge as it was in the Popular Woodworking plans, with the pin and the square arm. That's a good video to watch. It's a good reference video. But in this series, I'm going to show you how to make the gauge with this rounded arm and the cutting knife, because I think those are really good improvements and make a hell of a difference to the tool. And they're not really that hard to do either. Obviously, you don't have to watch this series of videos of mine to do this yourself, because it's not really hard to do. But for the beginners of you out there watching this, then you know, maybe it's a helpful series to you, well, hopefully. So what do you need to do? First, you need some wood, obviously. Body stock is anything which is hard and durable. I've got some beech here, but you can use maple, walnut, ebony, mahogany, or anything like that. And the kind of rough dimensions for an average sized marking gauge are, well, for this particular one, I've got a 6 centimeter wide, 10 centimeter tall, and by about an inch thick block for the body. And for the arm, this is, for this kind of a shape, you want this to be about 1/3 of the width of your body stock, squared. For this radius here, you'll actually be using a Forstner bit to drill a hole and then square off the corners. Now, if you already have a few Forstner bits, then make sure you size your arm to match one of the Forstner bits, so it saves you kind of, you know, chopping extra material out. But if you don't have a Forstner bit already, then choose an arm size which you can buy a Forstner bit for. So anything from 15 to 20 millimeters, I think, is a good range. Now, that's the wood. Oh, you need a little piece of wood for the wedge as well, which is like just a small piece of scrap. Not very important. For the blade, this is something probably beginners will be worrying about. Well, this is a piece of, this is actually a jigsaw blade. Now, these are good because these are good steel. They're sized roughly to the right size, so you only have to file the teeth off and kind of roughly square up the blank, and you have a blade for your marking gauge. They're also common and they're really cheap, so they're a good choice for a blade. Now, there are two varieties of steel they use in these blades, and the first is high carbon steel, and the second is high speed steel. High speed steel is more durable, but it's a lot harder to work by hand. So if you don't have a grinder or anything like that, then go for a high carbon steel blade. This is a Bosch brand blade, and the model number is T101BR. But the Bosch blades usually have HSS or HCS on them. So pick one of those, depending on what kind of tools you have to work metal with. Another thing you need is a sheet of brass. It doesn't have to be very big. You can see this is the corner cut off for the gauge I made. This is 1.5 millimeters thick. You want something thick enough to be able to hold a thread for your thumb screw in the end, but you don't want something too thick because it'll just get really hard to work. So 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters is about right, so that's about 1/16 of an inch. You said you don't need a very big piece. You need something big enough to cover the end of your arm stock. So find a piece of metal for that. It doesn't have to be brass. You can use steel, you can use stainless steel, but don't use something like aluminium because that just will not hold a thread. Now, the next thing you need is a little thumb screw of some sort. It doesn't have to be a thumb screw, it could be just a bolt, like a hex bolt. But this is an M4 by, I think, about 8 millimeters long thread. You don't want something too long because otherwise it'll just stick out the end of the arm and be a bit awkward. And you also don't want something that's too kind of thick in diameter. You want something smaller than the width of your blade. otherwise it will get kind of stuck in the mortise of the blade when you screw it in. So M4 or so is about correct. Last thing you need hardware wise is a few wood screws, small wood screws. These are 1.8mm by 10mm brass wood screws with a kind of cone flap head so you can countersink them. And you really want something small because these will be holding the plate down on the end of your arm. So I'm using 4 screws, so these have to be pretty small to be able to fit on there. Otherwise you'll kind of run out of wood to thread into. So find the smallest ones you can and use them. Other than that, I think that's pretty much all you need for materials. So the next thing we need to do is to mark out the body stock. But before you do that, obviously you want to square all your stock up and mark out your reference faces to measure from. And I'll show you how to do the marking for the mortise in the body and also the for the arm and for the wedge now. So square up your stock and I'll show you the marking. So now we're going to get to the marking. So this is the kind of basic layout we have. And the first thing you want to mark is this square mortise for the arm. And this is placed 1.5 times the kind of thickness of your arm up. So my arm is 20mm wide, so this is 30mm up from the bottom, and drawn a line here. And so I've marked off this square, 20mm square kind of mark here to drill out for my arm. And that's just centered left and right. And I've marked on the back as well. You don't need to mark it on the back, but I've did it just for a kind of reference mark. Once you've done that, you want to measure up 3.5mm or 1/8 of an inch from down, from the top of your arm mark and scribe a line across here. This is the bottom of your kind of wedge mortise, and that runs along the width of your body stock. And you need to do that so that you can actually make the captive wedge, so that you can put the wedge in, and then when you put the arm in, the wedge will go up and bear on the top of the arm here, locking the wedge in place. So 3.5mm down, scribe that all the way around, along there, both sides, and then from there, now on the thin end of your wedge mortise, mark up 11mm and put a line and mark that around the edge, one edge, and on the other side mark up 14 or so millimeters from here and mark around there, and this creates your angle here for your wedge. The kind of angle isn't really important as long as you match it on your wedge, so these measurements here are kind of arbitrary. Then on your ends here, you want to mark the thickness of your wedge. Now that's kind of arbitrary, but 1/4 inch to maybe, I don't know, 1/2 inch may be a bit too thick, but somewhere like, I've got 7mm, so just over 1/4 inch. I've centered that thickness there on the thickness of my body stock here, and I've just marked out the area here on both ends. And that basically completes your marking out for the body. You can see I've marked a little cross here, and all I've done is just taken a diagonal from the 4 corners and marked the center. So this is where I'm going to start the Forstner bit for this, for the drilling of this. But the first thing we need to do is we need to drill a vertical hole down here to help us in clearing out this wedge mortise, because if you don't do that first and you do this arm mortise first, what happens is your drill bit won't have anything to register against, and once it gets through into this mortise, you could kind of, snake around and it will push the drill bit off center. So do this hole first, and I'm going to do it by putting it in my drill press and drilling a vertical hole. I think the plan's called, or at least the Bob's video drills this hole angled, but I think it's easier to do it vertical and then to pare down this angle by hand later. So you know, pick a drill bit which is the same thickness as your mortise thickness here, and I'm just going to drill a hole down, and I'll show you that.